The darkest secret of the Ottoman Empire did not begin with swords drawn on a battlefield, but with leather-bound ledgers carried by government officials. In the winter of 1515, in a quiet Bulgarian village, men from the empire arrived not as raiders but as administrators. They came with records, quotas, and mathematical precision, reducing children to inventory numbers in their books. A 7-year-old boy was torn from his screaming mother and marched away, his fate decided long before he could even understand it. He was just one among thousands taken that year. This system was known as the Devshirme, a bureaucratic machine that turned child abduction into state policy. It wasn't random, nor was it hidden. It was documented, scheduled, and enforced with ruthless efficiency. Every Christian village owed a quota of boys, and Ottoman statisticians calculated the numbers with chilling accuracy. Marko Dimitrov, a boy of 7, appeared in these records months before the collectors arrived. His father's occupation, his health, even his physical build were noted, as if he were livestock. When the officials came, they went directly to his home and checked his name off a list like a delivery service confirming a package. The abductions were systematic. Boys between 7 and 20 were targeted, healthy, strong, and from regions known to produce quality candidates. They were lined up, inspected, and treated as merchants would handle horses. A French diplomat, Jean-Baptiste Tavannes, described the scene in 1631, horrified by the medical checks and physical assessments performed on children who had no choice. Communities resisted, but the punishment was brutal. In 1522, villages in Serbia erupted in rebellion after quotas were raised by nearly 40%. Places that once lost 20 sons now faced demands for 28, and in one town, officials even demanded boys as young as 6. The uprising left 3,000 dead. The Ottoman response was not to end the practice, but to improve their record-keeping to prevent inventory disputes. For 2 centuries, between 1450 and 1650, this system reached its peak. Historians, estimate that as many as 500,000 boys were taken, an average of 2,500 every single year. Imagine government officials arriving with spreadsheets not to collect taxes, but to take your children. That was daily reality in the empire's territories. The system was defended with religious justification. Scholars declared it virtuous, claiming the boys were being saved through conversion to Islam. In 1432, Sultan Murad II's chief Islamic judge issued a fatwa praising the practice as legal and holy. Yet behind this justification lay the destruction of families, the silencing of villages, and the industrial scale of human exploitation. This was not a story of isolated kidnappings. It was the story of an empire that turned cruelty into law, perfected it with bureaucracy, and enforced it with armies. And this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would grow darker with every passing decade. For the children taken, the abduction was only the first cut. The true horror began the moment they were loaded into wagons and marched away. Their names, their languages, their very identities were stripped from them with ruthless precision. They were not allowed to speak. Their native tongues and Turkish-speaking guards enforced silence with whips and fists. Imagine being 7 years old, frightened, ripped from your family, and not even allowed to cry out in the language you knew. The transformation was deliberate and immediate. Ottoman records from the Enderun schools detail the process with chilling precision. A 10-year-old Greek boy named Alexandros was taken in 1543. Within weeks, he was forced to answer to a new name, Ahmed. Training records show his progress. Week 1, he still responded to his birth name. Correction applied. Week 4, no longer responded to Alexandros. Week 12, fluent in basic Turkish prayers. By 6 months, his original identity was erased, and the Ottomans considered this a success story. Punishments for clinging to one's past were brutal. In 1547, guards discovered 50 boys whispering in Serbian during rest hours. The punishment was designed not only to break bodies, but to shatter minds. Each boy was forced to denounce his homeland and reject his birth name. Those who refused were thrown into isolation so long that when they emerged they could barely speak at all. Manuals from the empire even described how to build new men. One such document, preserved in Istanbul's archives, instructed trainers that a child must be made to believe his previous life was incomplete. Family ties were to be erased, replaced with devotion to the Sultan. When the child fully embraced his new identity, the transformation was declared complete. This reprogramming went hand in hand with physical changes. Boys were shorn with identical haircuts, dressed in the same rough wool garments, and fed identical meals at identical times. They slept in uniform rows, trained in rigid schedules, and were taught to move as one. The message was clear. Individuality no longer existed. You were no longer a son, a brother, or a villager. You were property of the empire. Survivor testimonies reveal the psychological devastation. Hassan Pasha, who lived through the program, wrote later in life, "I learned to forget the child I had been, for those memories brought only confusion and pain." That was the cruel genius of the system. By destroying memory, they destroyed resistance. By erasing identity, they created obedience. What modern psychology would call brainwashing, the Ottoman Empire perfected centuries earlier. These boys were not merely stolen, they were unmade, rebuilt as soldiers and servants who no longer belonged to themselves. The child was gone. In his place stood an Ottoman creation, loyal not because he chose to be, but because he had no past to return to, the Sai. Journey of these stolen boys did not end with their new names. Once their past identities were erased, they were delivered into facilities that functioned like factories, designed not to nurture children, but to mold them into instruments of the empire. These were the Enderun schools, where the Ottomans perfected psychological transformation through relentless control. Every detail of life was engineered to strip away individuality. Days began at the same hour, often before dawn, with prayers drilled into them in Turkish. Meals were identical, eaten in silence. Sleep came at the same fixed time, bodies lined up in rigid order. The architecture of the facilities was alien by design. Endless corridors, massive communal halls, and no familiar landscapes in sight. Nothing reminded these boys of home, because reminders bred resistance. Language was the sharpest weapon. Speaking their native tongue was a crime punished, with escalating cruelty. Instead, they were forced to memorize loyalty oaths in Ottoman Turkish, reciting them hundreds of times until those words became the only ones they knew. The boy who mastered Turkish prayers fastest received extra bread. The one who excelled in Islamic studies was rewarded with a wool blanket. A system of privileges created competition, forcing children to abandon their past in exchange for survival comforts. This was not random cruelty. It was a calculated method of reprogramming. Older recruits were assigned as brothers, supervisors, acted as fathers, creating artificial families designed to replace the ones these boys had lost. Through punishment and reward, dependence on this new structure was absolute. Observers described the results with unease. In 1578, Italian ambassador Lorenzo Bernardo visited one such training ground. He wrote of boys moving with mechanical precision, their individuality erased, their humanity reduced to obedience. To look at them was to see not children, but empty vessels filled with loyalty to the Sultan. The system was devastatingly effective. Records from 1562 to 1598 show that out of nearly 4,000 boys processed through just one facility, the overwhelming majority had completely adapted to their new identities within a year. Those who resisted were broken, redirected, or discarded. This was the Ottoman innovation. Identity wasn't simply taken, it was reconstructed. Childhood was dismantled piece by piece until nothing of the original self remained. What emerged was a body stripped of memory, a mind chained to the empire, and a spirit taught to believe that servitude was destiny. For the boys, freedom no longer meant returning home. Freedom was impossible, because the child who longed for home had already been destroyed. By the time the boys had been broken, reshaped, and stripped of identity, the Ottoman Empire faced its next decision: what to do with them. And this decision was not left to chance. It was systematic, calculated, and as cold as any business plan. The empire treated its captives like resources to be sorted for maximum value. Physical attributes, intelligence, and even regional stereotypes dictated their fate. Albanians were labeled loyal, Bosnians tall, Greeks intelligent. These stereotypes became criteria for assigning boys to specific roles. Some were funneled into the Janissary Corps, the empire's elite soldiers. Others were molded into palace servants, administrators, or personal attendants. Each child was processed like raw material in an assembly line of exploitation. Mortality rates were simply part of the equation. Training programs with higher death counts continued anyway, because the survivors were considered more valuable. Ottoman administrators ran cost-benefit analyses on human lives. Feeding, housing, and training costs were weighed against projected returns, as if these boys were nothing more than livestock investments. Records from 1598 reveal the staggering scale. That year alone, over 10,000 boys were processed through training centers. Thousands died along the way, but the losses were written off as acceptable. Survival was not the goal of the system. Utility. Those who lived were molded into soldiers, servants, or entertainers. Those who did not were replaced the next season. The logistics were industrial in scale. Major training hubs in Constantinople, Anatolia, and the Balkans allowed for efficient movement and processing. Caravans, ships, and road networks connected villages, collection points, and facilities in a web of organized exploitation. It was not chaos, it was strategy. The empire had turned human trafficking into a science. Even age became a calculated variable. Younger boys were preferred for long-term conditioning, while older ones could be fast-tracked into military campaigns. Centuries of data allowed the empire to refine which ages produced the best results for different roles. Imagine a government that tracked its people with spreadsheets, not to ensure safety or taxes, but to calculate which children would be most profitable if taken. That was the Ottoman model. A machine so vast and precise that death, identity, and childhood were simply variables in an equation of cruelty. For the empire, the boys were never children. They were assets, measured, sorted, and optimized for exploitation. For some boys, survival did not mean escape. Instead, it meant being funneled into another arm of Ottoman exploitation: public entertainment. From the training schools, the most graceful and physically striking were selected for a disturbing tradition known as the koçek. In the bustling heart of Constantinople, far from the battlefields and training grounds, Ottoman elites gathered in entertainment houses where young boys, often no older than 12, were forced to dance for crowds of merchants, officials, and soldiers. They wore elaborate costumes, performed intricate movements, and became living spectacles in a society that had turned exploitation into culture. This was not hidden in shadows. It was mainstream. By the 1650s, these performances were as normal to Ottoman nightlife as theater or concerts are today. Crowds showered the boys with coins, competed for their attention, and turned them into celebrities of their time. The most talented earned high fees for private performances, though the money never went into their hands. Managers, trainers, and guildmasters controlled every coin, feeding an industry that thrived on the bodies of children. The system was highly organized. The Istanbul Entertainment Guild, established in 1577, ran these performers as if they were craftsmen. There were apprenticeship programs, strict regulations, and even retirement structures for those who aged out of the profession. Imagine a trade union, not for artisans or builders, but for child entertainers. That was the reality of the Ottoman entertainment industry. The darker side could not be ignored. Performers lived under constant pressure, stripped of privacy, and placed in competitions that sometimes turned deadly. In one infamous riot in the 1650s, two officials clashed over a favored performer named Yaha. Their fight escalated into a street battle that left 12 dead and part of a city block in flames. The empire's response was not to question the exploitation, but simply to regulate competition more carefully. Memoirs from former performers reveal the glamour and the torment. Mehmed, who danced from 1702 to 1710, wrote of long years spent perfecting his craft, learning music, poetry, and movement, before being paraded before audiences across the empire. He achieved fame, but never freedom. His words describe not joy, but survival under the crushing weight of expectation. At its height in the late 1600s, Istanbul alone had nearly 3,000 active performers, with thousands more scattered across the empire. Entire schools were dedicated to training them, and audiences across every class of society consumed their art. This was not a marginal practice. It was a cultural institution built on stolen youth. The Koçak tradition survived well into the 19th century, ending only when European criticism made it a diplomatic embarrassment. Even then, it was not abolished quickly, merely phased out. Performances continued privately, long after the empire claimed to have moved on. For the boys, survival meant being transformed into entertainment, trained, displayed, and consumed by a society that normalized their exploitation as art. If the fate of boys was terrifying, the fate of women under the Ottoman system was even larger in scale, and no less horrifying. Constantinople, the empire's glittering capital, was not only a seat of power, it was the world's largest hub of human trafficking. At any given time, more than 300,000 enslaved women lived within the city, while thousands more were bought and sold every single month. The trade was not hidden. It was official, state-sanctioned, and taxed. The city's sprawling slave markets functioned like commercial centers, complete with auction blocks, price lists, inspectors, and government collectors. Women were classified, priced, and sold according to age, beauty, origin, and skills. A teenage girl from Ukraine might fetch a fortune, while an older woman or a mother with children could be bought cheaply. Human beings were reduced to entries, in an algorithm of supply and demand. Training compounds turned captivity into a twisted form of education. Women were housed in dormitories, drilled in Turkish language, Ottoman customs, music, and household management. Inspectors filed reports on their progress, rating them as if they were livestock being fattened for sale. One of the most famous cases was Roxolana, remembered by history as the beloved wife of Sultan Suleiman. In reality, she was a teenage captive, sold in the Constantinople markets, trained in these compounds and thrust into palace life not by choice, but by survival. The scale of the markets defies belief. Daily sales averaged 200 to 300 women, while special market days could see up to 1,000 sold. Families were torn apart as children were separated from mothers, husbands from wives. Buyers examined women openly, checking their health, inspecting their bodies, and assigning value as though they were cattle. European visitors wrote of the markets with horror, describing long lines of women forced to endure dehumanizing inspections, while crowds of men bartered for their futures. The rise system spanned continents. Caravans brought captives from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. Ships carried enslaved women from the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. North African traders supplied women from distant lands. The Ottoman slave network stretched across 3 continents, feeding an endless supply of human lives into Constantinople's markets. The impact on society was staggering. The Sultan's palace alone contained thousands of enslaved women, forming one of history's most infamous harems. And while some enslaved women might rise in status through favor or manipulation, the vast majority lived and died as property. Disease swept through the crowded markets, killing thousands, but instead of improving conditions, the empire simply imported more captives to replace the losses. Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1800, millions of women passed through Ottoman slave markets. This was not a side business. It was a central pillar of the empire's economy, woven into its culture and normalized as daily life. Behind the silks, the palaces, and the empire's grandeur lay an industry built on women's suffering. For the Ottoman elite, this was luxury. For the women, it was survival in a system that robbed them of freedom, family, and identity. The Ottoman Empire's cruelty went beyond abduction and slavery. It extended into something even more sinister, erasing evidence of its own crimes. Historians uncovered a disturbing demographic mystery in the empire's records. Constantinople's censuses from the 1600s show nearly 300,000 enslaved women living alongside 200,000 Ottoman men of reproductive age. Simple mathematics suggests this should have produced vast numbers of mixed heritage children. Yet, official records show almost none. The silence speaks volumes. Testimonies from midwives and survivors reveal why. Pregnancies were often hidden, suppressed, or eliminated. Maria, a Greek midwife in Constantinople, gave sworn testimony in 1621 describing how women were forced to undergo brutal household management procedures to prevent births from being recorded. Archaeological digs near former slave compounds uncovered mass burial sites, filled disproportionately with young women and infants, grim evidence of pregnancies erased from history. This was not accidental. Palace records from 1634 list budget expenses for demographic control measures, proving that the empire actively funded methods to conceal or destroy evidence of these relationships. Legal loopholes provided cover, with religious authorities issuing rulings that maintaining pure lineages was essential for social order. In practice, that meant eliminating children whose existence would blur the lines between enslaved and free. Survivor accounts describe the agony of women living under this shadow. A Circassian woman named Sultana, enslaved in 1642, testified that pregnancies in Ottoman households often ended in silence. Some women took desperate measures to avoid pregnancy altogether, while others suffered losses that were never acknowledged, their children erased before they could be recognized as human lives. Even medical texts from the period carry chilling hints. Euphemistic language about preventing complications or maintaining household health masked systematic efforts to ensure that generations of enslaved women left no trace in official records. The absence of mixed populations in Ottoman society was not natural, it was engineered. The psychological toll was devastating. Women lived with the constant fear that motherhood itself was forbidden. Many fell into despair, some prayed for infertility, and others endured repeated trauma, knowing their children would never be allowed to exist. Historians now recognize this as a form of demographic manipulation, a system that erased entire lineages. From history, modern genetic studies confirm the truth. Despite millions of enslaved women passing through Ottoman territories over 4 centuries, today's Turkish population shows surprisingly little trace of African or Slavic heritage. The numbers reveal what the records tried to hide. The empire systematically destroyed evidence of the generations it exploited. This was not only slavery, it was erasure, not just of individuals, but of entire bloodlines. The Ottoman Empire did not merely own people. It controlled who was allowed to be born and who was condemned never to exist. For the Christian families living under Ottoman rule, the threat of collection was constant. Parents knew the day might come when officials would march into their village with ledgers in hand demanding their sons. And when that day came, many made the most desperate choice imaginable. They harmed their own children to save them. This was not myth or legend. It is recorded history. In 1689, in the Bulgarian village of Koprastitz, word spread that Ottoman collectors were approaching. Over 3 nights, parents gathered in secret and did the unthinkable. They blinded, crippled, or scarred their sons, so they would be considered unfit for collection. When the officials arrived, out of 92 eligible boys, 89 had been deliberately disabled. Personal testimonies reveal the unbearable weight of these decisions. In 1654, a priest named Father Dmitri wrote of blinding his 8-year-old son, Georgi. His confession reads, "I harmed my beautiful boy to save him from a worse fate. His cries haunt me still, but I pray God will forgive what love made necessary. Better he live broken than die in Turkish service." Parents developed methods to inflict harm without killing, broken bones that would heal crooked, burns that left lasting scars, missing fingers or eyes that marked a child as damaged goods. Some even created elaborate deceptions, faking disabilities to trick inspectors. But the Ottomans adapted. Manuals from 1718 show officials trained to distinguish genuine injuries from staged ones, turning even parental love into something the state monitored and punished. The trauma of these choices scarred entire generations. Children grew up knowing their injuries were not accidents, but acts of desperate love. Some accepted them as marks of salvation. Others resented them, angry at parents who had robbed them of a whole life, even if it meant survival. The emotional toll was profound. Songs and poems from the era capture mothers singing lullabies while disfiguring their children, soothing them with love even as they caused pain. Archaeological evidence confirms the accounts. Skeletons of children from the period show suspiciously uniform injuries, crooked limbs, missing digits, and facial trauma consistent with deliberate harm. But the cruelty did not end there. Sometimes Ottoman officials, suspecting mass resistance, took disabled children anyway as punishment. In 1702 in Serbia, 23 boys with severe injuries were marched away regardless. Their suffering turned into an example for others. Some villages created networks of specialists, men and women who knew how to inflict survivable injuries, charging desperate parents for their knowledge. Others divided the burden, designating certain families to sacrifice their sons so others could claim their boys were already unfit. Survival became an economy of broken bodies. For the Ayyubiyat parents, the choice was impossible: watch their sons taken into slavery, or hurt them with their own hands to keep them near. For the children, survival often came at the cost of living with scars that would never heal, physical and emotional marks of a love that had to wound in order to protect. The scars of this system did not vanish with a single generation. They stretched across centuries, shaping communities long after the collectors were gone. Boys who survived with deliberate disabilities grew up carrying visible reminders of the love that had saved them. Limps, blindness, missing fingers. Some wore those wounds with pride, believing their parents had sacrificed everything to keep them safe. Others carried resentment, bitter that their own families had crippled them, even if it was done to protect. The psychological burden was heavier still. Survivors of the Devshirme who endured indoctrination often never returned home, not because they were forbidden, but because they no longer knew who they were. A man stripped of his language, his faith, his memories, how could he reclaim the role of son, brother, or husband? Many lived and died in service, unable to connect to the families who once wept for them. Communities were reshaped by this trauma. Entire villages became filled with men marked by injury. Folk songs from the Balkans tell of generations who called themselves the limping, the sightless, the broken, living proof of parents' desperate love. These scars became part of cultural memory, visible evidence of what it meant to survive. Under Ottoman rule, even birth records revealed traces of resistance. In some regions, sudden drops in the number of boys born, or suspicious spikes in stillbirths, suggest that parents and midwives conspired to hide or even prevent the births of sons who would one day be taken. Entire networks of midwives, healers, and priests emerged, helping families navigate impossible choices. Some disguising children as girls, others reporting false deaths. The Ottoman state responded with more inspections, more punishments, more suspicion. Manuals were updated with methods to detect false injuries, and collectors were instructed to take damaged goods to discourage resistance. But the more the state pressed, the more families adapted, creating a cycle of cruelty and defiance that lasted for centuries. Generational trauma passed like inheritance. Parents who had harmed their children carried guilt that never faded. Children who grew up disabled carried confusion and anger. Grandchildren inherited stories of sacrifice, whispered in shame or sung in sorrow. Communities lived under a shadow of fear so constant that even after the Devshirme system ended in the 19th century, the memory lingered like a wound that never fully healed. The legacy was not just broken bodies, it was broken identities. Families torn apart, villages hollowed, cultures reshaped by loss. For centuries, Christian communities across the empire lived in the aftermath of a system that had turned childhood into a commodity, parenthood into torment, and survival into a lifelong scar. The story of the Ottoman system is not simply about slavery. It is about the perfection of exploitation, turned into official state policy, recorded in ledgers and executed with bureaucratic precision. Every entry in those archives represents a child taken, a family shattered, a community scarred forever. The empire's grandeur, its palaces, armies, and wealth, was built on the suffering of hundreds of thousands of boys and millions of women. They were catalogued like property, processed like goods, and consumed as soldiers, servants, and entertainers. This was not the work of criminals hiding in shadows. It was the work of administrators, judges, and scholars who declared it legal, virtuous, and necessary. That is the most terrifying truth. The men who tore children from their mothers, who ran schools designed to erase identities, who bought and sold women in open markets. Many of them went home at night to their own families, kissed their own children, and never saw themselves as monsters. They were simply doing their jobs. History forces us to confront that ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when systems normalize it. The Ottoman Empire was not uniquely monstrous. It was uniquely efficient. It documented its horrors with a precision that still chills us today. Modern human trafficking, which enslaves over 40 million people worldwide, follows the same patterns: dehumanization, bureaucracy, exploitation hidden behind legitimacy. The difference is only in language. What the Ottomans called policy, we now call crime. But the suffering is the same. That is why these stories must be remembered. Not to demonize a single empire, but to remind us what happens when power operates without accountability, when faith or culture is twisted into justification, when human beings are reduced to property, in the eyes of the law. Today, your children can keep their names, their families, their freedom. The basic dignity we take for granted was denied to millions for over 6 centuries. And those who forget history's darkest chapters are the ones most likely to repeat them. The Ottoman Empire left behind its palaces, its conquests, and its architecture. But its truest legacy lies in the broken lives of those it enslaved. To remember them is not just history, it is a warning. Because exploitation thrives when silence is louder than truth.